hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 160 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Friday evening with me here in New York. If you end up checking out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. So I'm wearing one of my Ali shirts. Now, Ali, as Cassius Clay, actually fought on this day in 1961. He was 5-0, and he fought this kind of knockout artist named Lamar Clark, who had a crazy record of, it was like 42-2 with 40 knockouts. It was something insane like that, but his record was padded. He fought a lot of people who weren't really fighters. It was not a real record. And young Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali, just really ripped through the guy. And Clark was a big dude, but man, the kid was just dynamite. He was throwing everything under the sun and landing, and it was over in 2 rounds. And Lamar Clark never fought again. He really had no business being in there with somebody as talented as Clay, who was already Olympic gold medalist. But you look at a guy's record, he's a big guy. He's got 41 knockouts in 42. This guy must be really tough. Well, yeah, he's tough by normal person standards, but not by the young Cassius Clay. But that's not the on this day we're going to talk about. On this day, 1991, 2 of easily the 10 greatest heavyweight champions in the history of boxing. There are some that would probably put Foreman in the top 5 because he regained the title. Certainly in terms of dominance in prime, Foreman is in the conversation. But on this day, 1991, a prime Evander Holyfield took on comebacking 42-year-old George Foreman in Atlantic City. And how those 2 guys ended up in the ring for the heavyweight championship involves a couple of other legendary names in the sport of boxing, one being Muhammad Ali and the other being Mike Tyson. So the backstory of that fight is that George Foreman won the heavyweight championship in 1973 from Joe Frazier. Now, it would almost seem that, well, he must have won the title from Ali, but that's not what happened. Ali, in his exile period, in the 60s, that's when Frazier won the title. And then when Frazier defeated Ali in the famous fight of the century, kind of sealing it with a 15th round knockdown, although I think he was going to win on points anyway. It's as if he won the title. He won the honorary, or the kind of, the title as far as people's champion and kinds of things that, I mean, either you have the hardware or you don't, but that was an example of 2 undefeated champions squaring off. And well, how the hell could there be undefeated champions if they're in the same division? It would have to be a crazy scenario like that. So George Foreman won the 1968 Olympic gold medal in Mexico City. He still seemed raw. And that's one of the kind of great things about George Foreman is, yeah, the guy knew how to punch, of course. He had incredible footwork. But if you look at his delivery of punches, they're not really that clean, which isn't to say that he didn't know how to throw a left hook or a right cross or an uppercut, but he threw weird punches. He threw strange roundhouse punches. And Ali used to joke. He said, George throws punches. He used to say, it's like somebody who's washing something. He's like, huh, 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 huh. And people thought it was funny, but if you watch George Foreman, he threw what Ali called the anywhere punch. George throws them anywhere punch. He's got to be careful in there. What do you mean by anywhere punch? Anywhere he hits you, it hurts. If he hits you on the point of the chin, the fight's over. The anywhere punch. So the idea is that Foreman had very few amateur fights. You know, young Cassius Clay had over 100 amateur fights before getting to the Olympics at age 18. I don't think George Foreman even had 20 amateur fights before going to the Olympics. That is how dominant George Foreman was. So in the Olympics, he wasn't even challenged. He went against a Russian who was one of the top amateurs in the world, and he busted the guy up. The guy was bleeding all over the ring. Now, when young Cassius Clay won Olympic gold in 1960, the guy he faced in the finals, Ziggy Petrikowski, was another top-flight amateur, and Ali busted up his nose. Excuse me, Clay. He was Clay at that point. So George Foreman was a huge prospect. He was raw, but it almost didn't matter that he was raw because his skill level, his size, the intimidation factor, and the fact that he looked as if he was slow and plodding, but he wasn't. And the other thing is, because he had so many easy fights, no one knew how relentless George Foreman could be. That his will to win rivaled even that of Ali, his, arch rival turned BFF. And I'm not joking. That's true. Foreman wouldn't have seemed like a guy who burned to win almost as much as guys like Ali did. Maybe he did, actually. But when you have easy fights, it's difficult to tell just how much when the chips are down or when it looks like you're not going to win the fight. Now what? And some of the great ones, like Evander Holyfield, found that reservoir in deep water. They weren't the ones who drowned. And you looked at Ali in some of his famous fights, Frazier and Manila. Both Ali and Frazier were masters of deep water fights. They tried to drown each other. Foreman won the world heavyweight title and famously lost it to Ali in Africa in a fight that, most people thought he was going to win easily. As George said himself years later, listen, I love Muhammad. I loved him as a fighter, certainly coming up in the 60s as I was. I loved watching the guy fight. Got a raw deal, But if you asked me, did I think I was going to win? Yeah. You could tell he wasn't as fast as he'd been in the 60s. And he had 2 losses, tough fights, but he had 2 losses on his record. And I beat both of those guys. And I beat him easily. So knowing that, of course I thought I was going to win. George didn't win. George lost a very difficult fight where it seemed as if he was in control, but he really was never in control. The closest he came to gaining control was the 5th round. He landed a couple of absolute bombs to the side. He landed a left hook that would have ended the fight with almost anyone in history except Muhammad Ali, who not only did he take headshots, unfortunately for his health, he took headshots. You could hit him on the point of the chin where most guys would be unconscious and he'd keep moving forward. Is that all you got? Foreman in the 74 fight hit Ali with a left hook and a right to the side that should have, at the very least, dropped Ali to a knee. Let alone he's on his knee for 5 minutes. Ryan Garcia in the fight with not Devin Haney, with Tank. He took a body shot, goes down, and he's on his knee, and he could have counted to 100, even though he got up after 10. George landed a couple of body shots that should have ended the fight. And when he kind of stepped back, wondering, okay, why isn't he falling? And Ali screamed, "Is that all you got?" George said, "I knew I wasn't winning the fight. It is all I got. Fuck you." But George lost to Ali. He had a tough fight with Ron Lyle, which was like a Rocky movie fight where each guy got knocked down a bunch of times. But George, in that fight, it's not that he didn't show any gumption in Zaire, because after the 5th round, you knew Ali was going to win. George was still trying. He was still winning. He was exhausted. His spirit was broken, but he didn't quit. He gave it everything he had. And even in the 8th round, Zach Clayton gave him a fast count. George is on his feet, and Zach is saying 8, and then suddenly he's waving the fight over because the fight was over. It didn't matter what the count was. George wasn't going to win, but he was willing to keep trying. He beat Ron Lyle because he refused to give up in a fight where Lyle was really kicking the shit out of him. That was actually one of Ali's best performances against Ron Lyle because Lyle landed some bombs. Ali was barely moving, and he stopped Lyle, landed a couple of huge shots, and stopped him in the 11th round. Foreman lost a fight he should have won to, could be the most underrated heavyweight in history, Jimmy Young. Because Jimmy Young didn't hit hard, but he was a great boxer. He was a counterpuncher. He was tricky with his defense. And it was a fight that George should have won. He lost. And after that fight, George claimed he had an out-of-body experience. He talked to God, or God talked to him. And he stopped fighting. He left boxing. He became a preacher. He lived a different life than maybe he had conceived for himself as a younger person when he was running through the heavyweight division, when everyone was scared of him. You know, there was Sonny Liston, and there was George Foreman, and then there was Mike Tyson. Heavyweights who hit hard, who everyone was scared of, who were dominant. It didn't quite turn out exactly the way they thought. But George left boxing when he should have still been in his physical prime. He was 27. He walked away. And he came back in 86, I think it was, and he may have even fought on an undercard of one of Tyson's early fights. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that there was a Foreman and Tyson connection where George fought on the undercard very early. Now, his comeback appeared to be a novelty. He fought a lot of tomato. He fought a guy, Steve Zowski, who also fought Tyson. And for what it's worth, I think Zowski said George hits harder, but he's not as fast. Now, George had been a guy who looked like a bodybuilder. He had that incredible, I shouldn't say he looked like a bodybuilder. He was about 220 plus, pure muscle. He was just diesel and jacked. He was a naturally, massively muscular guy, like pure mesomorph, as was Mike Tyson, for that matter. Whereas somebody like Ali was closer to what you would call an ectomesomorph. Because Ali, without any weight training, there are shots of him in the 60s when he's like 23 or 24, where he looks pretty jacked. Doesn't look like a bodybuilder because he didn't work out with weights. But you see, this guy is not skinny anymore. He competed as a light heavyweight in the Olympics. He weighs 35 pounds more, and his body fat is the same. I mean, all the top guys look great. But George's comeback was looked upon as a joke and a novelty. But he kept pushing forward, kind of needed the money for his church, and, you know, he had a lot of kids, and maybe had a dream that someday he would get to challenge for the heavyweight championship again. So he fought a lot of fringe contenders and people who had decent records but were sort of past their prime, like Tony Fulalangi was a kind of a knockout artist, but by the time he fought George, his record still looked good. But he didn't have a chance. And he fought Dwight Cowie after Cowie's wars with Evander Holyfield. And George was just too damn big for Cowie. He was too big. And yes, one of the great light heavyweights for sure, the former Dwight Braxton, and a terrific defensive fighter. But George ran right through him. He ran right through him. The key fight for George, though, was when he went against Jerry Cooney. Even though Cooney was clearly past it, he still seemed like a live contender. He wasn't that old. Jerry was very young when he got to fight Larry Holmes, when he came up through the ranks. And it was a little over a year before Foreman and Holyfield fought. And a lot of people thought Cooney was going to win because he was younger and he looked fresher. And George, there were some of his early comeback fights before Cooney where he didn't look that impressive, where he went the distance with guys that he should have taken their head. Bigfoot Martin went the distance. Guys like Rocky Sikorsky were in there with him trading leather. He didn't look that great. I didn't think he was going to make it anywhere. I thought that he was, going to continue to fight these kind of second and third rate type of fighters and not face anybody. And eventually he would retire. I was a kid at 14, 15 when this was going on. But then the Cooney fight. Tyson was still champ. Hadn't fought Buster Douglas yet. The Douglas fight, I think, was a few weeks away. And the sense was there were people, because of the name and because of the attractiveness from a marquee perspective, if George gets by Cooney, because there's not going to be nobody's going to be calling for Jerry Cooney to face Tyson. Cooney had already lost to Michael Spinks. Nobody would have wanted to see that fight, no matter what Cooney did. But George, by virtue of his extraordinary record, George only had 2 losses. the only guys that had beaten him were Ali and Jimmy Young. The Jimmy Young fight was really kind of close enough where they could have almost given it to George on points, even though he got knocked down late in the fight. George went out a little cautious, and I watched the fight live. My mom, we got the pay-per-view. We had a few people over, and we were all rooting for George. But the idea was, because of his name, his record, the fact that he's not going to be intimidated by Mike Tyson, he's going to look like he's twice Tyson's size. If anything, Tyson's going to not want to fight him. Fucking guy is huge. I saw all of his fights. If he still hits like that, he could beat me. We don't know what Tyson was actually thinking at that time. But the idea was, if George is impressive, there will be people clamoring. If they're not able to get Tyson and Holyfield together, let's go. Let's fucking go. So George went out, and the first round was fairly competitive. And Cooney landed a couple of nice shots, but George was still moving forward. And even though Cooney, you could argue maybe he won the first round, he didn't look that impressive. He was fighting while backing up. Never a good idea if you're a puncher. You know, when the fight was billed as the preacher versus the puncher being Jerry Cooney. Cooney's not that impressive in the first round because he's backing up, and he's a big dude. That's not how you're going to beat George Foreman, because Foreman knows how to cut off the ring, and you start retreating, he's just going to walk you down and carve you up, which is exactly what happened. In round two, Foreman really got him. They had a knockdown, which was kind of a heavy knockdown, but it didn't seem like the fight was going to be over. Cooney appeared to be okay. He was shaken up. But as he was getting to his feet, it didn't seem like, okay, this fight's about to be over. He was giving, the ref said, okay, nodded his head. He did not seem like he was wobbly at all. He went down from the force of the blows that George just hit him so hard, he went down. He seemed like he still had it together. And then George landed an uppercut. He walked towards Cooney, and almost as if he said, I had enough of this guy, landed an uppercut and basically knocked him unconscious. The ref, Joe Cortez, waved it off. There wasn't any point in counting. Foreman was so dominant in that fight. Now, people thought he might win, but they thought he might win in a ponderous slog of a fight like he had had in some of his other early comeback fights. But the way he did it, people were saying, we need to take George seriously. This is not a novelty act. Lou Duva and some other trainers said, Cooney was ready for this fight. People thought Cooney was going to George can't really fight anymore. So then they started to talk about, what about Tyson? But all of that came crashing down when Tyson lost to Buster Douglas. And in short order after that, Buster didn't take the championship as seriously as he could have. And he really lost just an awful fight to Holyfield, where you would have thought that Buster Douglas was just a random club fighter and not a guy who had gone toe-to-toe and won almost every round of the Tyson fight. You could argue the only round that Tyson won cleanly was the 9th round, which was the round where Tyson knocked him down, but Douglas was almost had a 10-8 round before the knockdown. He was a dominant fighter and beat an all-timer in what should have been his prime, because Tyson was still so young. He went out there against Evander and just got his clock cleaned. And then there were people that were saying that he didn't even try. Evander landed a big shot, but the way that Buster dropped, it appeared that his eyes were clear and he simply didn't want to continue. And I don't know, that seems unlikely. But the referee, was it Mills Lane? The referee said it looked like he was okay and he just made a tactical decision. Maybe he didn't want to get humiliated anymore, whatever. But Evander beat Buster Douglas late in 1990. And because of how impressive George had been against Cooney and in some of the fights leading up to it, the match was set. And that is how April 19, 1991 came to pass. A lot of things had to happen in the careers of both guys because, and of course Mike Tyson then went to prison. We forgot about that. So there was no version of reality, regardless of losing to Douglas. Tyson was not going to be fighting a return match, or because he fought Razor Ruddock, there was no process by which he was going to suddenly get a title crack against Holyfield after Holyfield beat Douglas. So they signed the contracts for Foreman and Holyfield, and there's a lot of giggles, and George was funny. You know, he was only 42, but he seemed older. He was kind of roly-poly, but he was strong as an ox. And the guys had a lot of laughs, making fun of the fact that, you know, George, if you think you can beat me, you're off your rocker. Like, he's so old, he needs a rocking chair. And the fight went off, and there were people who didn't think that Foreman should have gotten the fight, that they felt, well, we don't really know that much. Maybe Cooney was completely shot. Evander's in his prime. Nobody wanted George to get hurt. But there were people who felt he shouldn't be getting this title shot now. And hopefully he doesn't get hurt, but he shouldn't have gotten the title shot. But there really wasn't, like, Holyfield wasn't going to fight Razor Ruddock because Ruddock had fought Tyson twice. The first fight was kind of a ridiculous stoppage. And the second fight, Tyson won cleanly, but it was a terrific fight. It went the distance. Ruddock was tough. So Foreman and Holyfield went out there and they fought all 12 rounds. It went to the cards. And Evander won the fight on the cards going away. But when it was over, on the HBO broadcast, which was pay-per-view, they all said Evander won the fight, and at certain points, he was winning it going away. But nobody can say that George was not a worthy challenger for the belt. He went the distance with a great champion, and there were a couple of moments in the fight where he landed some big bombs, and if Evander hadn't been as tough as he was, because Evander could take big shots and continue walking through them and walking forward. He did it against Tyson. You watch the first Tyson fight. Tyson lands that classic hook to the body uppercut combo that had separated Frank Bruno from his senses, Trevor Berbick, and a lot of other, top-end fighters. He landed that same combo early enough in the fight where Mike still had all of his energy, and Evander just kind of shrugged his shoulders as if to say, yeah, we're in a fight. Let's go. Still here. Not going down like some of the other guys you fought. George landed some shots on Evander. Didn't look as clean as maybe the punch that stopped Michael Moorer years later. But Evander took a lot of heavy fire, and he later said, no, George is for real. I wasn't fucking around, and he hit me about as hard as anybody's ever hit me. Evander had the condition, he had the chin, and he had that kind of champion spirit that can't be quantified. That even if he's not 100% cognizant of what's happening, he always knows what to do. He knows how to tie up his opponent for the few precious seconds to kind of clear the head enough where if he gets hit again, the fight's not going to be over. Like that kind of thing. So it went 12. And Evander, as we say, won the fight. He won probably 9 or 10 rounds. But George gave enough of an account of himself where his career continued. And it really wouldn't have been much of a call for a rematch against Holyfield. Evander was just too fast, and he was too strong, and his style of fighting was wrong for that era Foreman. Now, younger Foreman would not have walked through Evander Holyfield, but he certainly would have been quick enough. George was not really a plotter. He seemed like a plotter when he was younger, but he wasn't. But as an older fighter, there was a lot of pushing and holding, and, he was always moving his opponents backwards. I think the young Foreman would have had the advantage against prime Holyfield, but I think Evander beats him certainly at least one time out of 3. But that's neither here nor there. Nobody would have wanted to see a return fight. Evander had some health issues. He lost to Michael Moorer. It was kind of a disputed decision because Evander scored a knockdown early in the fight. And George lost a kind of, again, another tough fight to Tommy Morrison, who had been in Rocky V. So he was also an actor, but he was a really good fighter. Tommy Morrison, he had a couple of brutal losses. Was it Ray Mercer? He had a couple of tough losses, but he beat a lot of top guys, including George. And he went toe-to-toe with George. He wasn't intimidated. It was a good fight. But after George lost the fight to Morrison, it seemed as if, well, that's it. Where does he go from here? Who's he going to fight? Luckily, miraculously, I think it was November of 1994, Michael Moore signed to fight George Foreman. George had a network sitcom called George that aired. He was a star. He hadn't done the grilling machines yet. That was a little later. Most people didn't think that George had any chance to beat Moore because he was older. The Foreman of the Holyfield fight, they felt, well, he certainly would have a better chance because he held his own with an Evander that was better than the one that Moore defeated. It's 3.5 years later. And Moore is still in his prime. And Moore really wasn't a great heavyweight. He would have been a great cruiserweight. His best weight would have been fighting more like a 195 to 200 as opposed to where he fought. He didn't really have the heavyweight chin. And that's the difference with Holyfield, because Holyfield started as a cruiser. He had a hellaciously strong chin. We saw him walk through shots from Riddick Bowe in those fights and just keep pressing on and not really Lennox certainly shook him up, but he was tough as nails. Man, was he strong. And he was really difficult to even make woozy in the ring. Bowe in the last fight, even more so. Evander kind of ran out of gas. People thought he was washed up. But Foreman and Moore was the rare heavyweight championship fight, which was broadcast on regular HBO. And my dad and I watched it almost 30 years ago. And I didn't think George was going to win. And if you watch the fight, it's not really that exciting of a fight. Because Moore he was a southpaw, so that was the first problem. And George was having difficulty staying out of the way of Moore's jab. And Moore was shifty and quick. A little bit of Jersey Joe Walcott in his footwork. And I don't even know if George won as many as 2 rounds out of the first 9. But Moore seemed to kind of slow down a little bit. And Teddy Atlas, who was his trainer, was basically shouting at him, you got to stop standing in front of this guy. Implying you're winning the fight. Don't be stupid. You know he's not going to run around the ring and chase you. If you don't stand in front of him, it makes it more difficult for him to square you up. Boxing 101. Follow a boxer to take his crown, follow a puncher, you get knocked down. That's George's famous quote. He used to say it on the HBO broadcasts. Don't follow Foreman around the fucking ring. Don't do it. Because you give him a chance to get a target. Now, we don't know if he can still hit the way he did in the 70s. We don't need to find out. He certainly hit Holyfield hard enough 3.5 years ago. So Moore in the 10th round, for reasons unknown, maybe he thought he was going to try to knock George out. I don't know what he was doing, but he started kind of trading shots. It's okay to trade shots if you're moving away from Foreman's power, but he really wasn't doing that. And there's a clash of arms, and George lands a punch. It doesn't seem to be loaded, and then he lands just a short right. It didn't really even look like a punch that George loaded up, but Moore went down like he'd been shot. And suddenly, fight was over. And George Foreman had regained the World Heavyweight Championship 20 years and 1 week after he had lost it to Ali. He was wearing the same trunks that he fought in that fateful night in Zaire. And Angelo Dundee, Ali's trainer, he actually had trained George, I think, for the Holyfield fight. I don't know if he was in George's corner that night. That I don't know. But George, the preacher, got down on his knees in the corner, and he looked up at the heavens. And it was as if the vindication for that terrible night in Zaire for him, the fight that he felt that he should have won and didn't. The comeback that people didn't take seriously until the losing fight to Evander Holyfield, George Foreman. The way he looked up at the sky. And then George, actually, he held the title for a couple of years. He and Ali famously took part in an Oscar-winning documentary, which won the Academy Award for Best Documentaries, released in 1996. It was on the Rumble in the Jungle, the fight in Zaire. There had been a lot of footage, and the filmmaker, Leon Gass, just was not able to complete the film. He didn't have the funds for all those years. Then they were able to get it together. Taylor Hackford and other people got involved. And there's Muhammad Ali and George Foreman on the Oscar stage in 1997. And Will Smith, who later played Ali in the movie, presented the Best Documentary Award to Leon Gass, the filmmaker. And they had Ali and Foreman come on stage, which was really amazing. And the place was going crazy. But George retired in 97 after really a fight that he beat the crap out of Shannon Briggs, and they gave Briggs a decision. But George Foreman, his career record was 76-5. The 5 losses. Ali, Jimmy Young, Evander Holyfield, Tommy Morrison, and Shannon Briggs, which is a fight that George just almost took Briggs' head off. I don't know what the hell the judges were doing. I think they just didn't want George to fight anymore because he was old. And Evander, as we know, fought too long. He fought way too long. He should have retired probably after the first Lennox Lewis fight, which was a majority draw, but he was so much slower to me than he had looked in even the second fight with Mike Tyson. Ideally, Evander would have retired after the second Tyson fight, the earbite. But he soldiered on, and he was still terrific. He still won big fights, but he didn't look like Evander. He moved slower, didn't have the same stamina. And, and you hate to see it when he had the fight a couple of years ago with Vitor Belfort, the MMA guy, even him fighting James Toney and losing to James Toney, horrendous. You hate that somebody like Evander stayed on too long. And, George, for all of the shots that he took, he looks great. He's still the same old George, funny as ever, is never not a great interview. And those two guys, Evander Holyfield and George Foreman, who fought 33 years ago today, and George always rooted for Evander. When I think it was during the first Lennox Lewis fight, George was openly rooting. He was openly rooting for Evander because he saw Evander as, well, keep the title in America. He was almost kind of goofing around, but he clearly loved Evander, and he wanted Evander to win that fight. But 33 years ago today, George Foreman and Evander Holyfield in Atlantic City, and all of the history and all of the legendary names attached to them that helped make that night happen. It was a legacy fight. It is a classic fight. More exciting than anybody expected, because George fought in spurts. He wasn't necessarily known as an action fighter in that era because he couldn't wing the way that he had as a much younger person. But those two guys put on a great fight. It was way better than when Holyfield fought Larry Holmes the next year. That was a 12-round snooze fest. It was a great fight between two of the greats to ever lace up the gloves. George Foreman and Evander Holyfield, both multiple heavyweight champions. I think Evander regained the title twice and George regained it once. April 19, 1991. This has been episode 160 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me for another trip down memory lane of the fight game and legends, old school, vintage, and all of this stuff is available on YouTube, which is amazing. You can go watch Foreman versus Holyfield right now. Great fight. You won't be disappointed. And you'll come back to me and you'll say, there were moments it looks like Foreman's going to get him. But if you caught episode 160 on the YouTube channel, enjoyed it, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 161 real soon. Till then,